They say the tallest skyscrapers are built on the deepest foundations, but they never tell you that those foundations are often soaked in the tears of the person who stayed when everyone else ran. I spent 30 years holding the ladder while he climbed to the stars, only to realize that once he reached the top, he didn't look down to pull me up. He looked down to see if I was still small enough to keep under his boot. You think you know the person sleeping beside you until the lights of success reveal a stranger who views your loyalty as a liability and your sacrifice as a transaction he is no longer willing to pay. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. My name is Janet, and for 3 decades, I was the silent architect of a legacy that does not bear my name. When I met Marcus, he was a man with nothing but a frantic ambition and a desk made of plywood and cinder blocks. I was the one who worked 3 jobs to fund his first shipment of inventory. I was the one who stayed up until dawn balancing ledgers while he slept, dreaming of the mogul he would eventually become. I traded my youth, my rest, and my own aspirations to ensure his vision became a reality. We were a team, or so I believed, building a kingdom brick by brick in a world that didn't want us to succeed. But as the bank accounts grew and the plywood was replaced by mahogany, the air between us began to chill. The man who once promised we would rule together started looking at me not as a partner, but as a relic of a past he desperately wanted to erase. I was the living reminder of his struggle, and in the high-stakes world of billionaire elites, struggle is a blemish that must be removed. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, calculated dismantling of my presence in his life, leading up to a single evening where the ghost of a woman I didn't recognize walked through our front door to claim the seat I had spent 30 years earning. The mahogany doors of our estate didn't just keep the world out. They began to lock me into a gilded cage of silence where my voice carried no weight. It started with the small things, meetings I was no longer invited to, passwords changed on accounts I had managed for decades, and the subtle, sharp way Marcus would correct my speech in front of his new high society associates. He began to speak of his empire and his vision, conveniently forgetting the nights I spent scrubbing floors to pay for his first business license. One evening, the tension reached a breaking point during a gala we hosted for the city's elite. I stood in the corner of our grand ballroom, watching him charm a crowd of investors with stories of his self-made success. He didn't mention the woman who had stood in the rain outside shipping docks to ensure his cargo was secure. When a prominent board member asked who I was, Marcus paused, a flicker of coldness crossing his eyes before he offered a thin, polite smile and described me as his longtime assistant who helped with the transition. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I wasn't his wife in that moment. I wasn't the co-founder of the Sterling Group. I was a ghost from a past he was systematically rewriting. Later that night, in the oppressive silence of our master suite, I confronted him about the disrespect. He didn't yell, he didn't apologize. He simply adjusted his silk tie in the mirror and told me that the world he lived in now required a certain aesthetic, one that my weary face and calloused hands no longer fit. He suggested, with a chilling calmness, that perhaps it was time for me to take a permanent vacation at our coastal property, far away from the cameras, far away from the business, and far away from him. It was then I realized that the man I had loved was gone, replaced by a monster of my own making, and he was already preparing a place for someone else to step into the life I had built. The coastal property he mentioned wasn't a gift. It was an exile, a beautiful prison designed to bury the woman who knew too much about the cracks in his foundation. For weeks, I sat by the window of that lonely house, watching the waves crash against the rocks, feeling my heart do the same as I realized the extent of his treachery. While I was tucked away in the salt air, Marcus was busy scrubbing my name from every legal document and corporate record we had ever signed together. I began to receive envelopes from lawyers I had never met, containing papers that spoke of divorce settlements and confidentiality agreements, as if our 30 years of marriage were nothing more than a failed business merger. But the true horror revealed itself on a Tuesday afternoon when I decided to drive back to the city unannounced. I used my old key to enter the penthouse, expecting to find Marcus buried in work, but instead, the air was filled with a scent that wasn't mine, a heavy, expensive floral perfume that felt like an intrusion. As I walked toward the dining room, I saw her. She was barely 30, a woman who looked like a polished diamond, wearing the vintage pearls Marcus had given me for our 10th anniversary. She wasn't just a guest. She was moving through the rooms with the confidence of an owner, rearranging my furniture and discarding my photographs into a cardboard box as if she were clearing out the remains of a dead woman. When Marcus walked in and saw me standing there, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He stood beside her, placed a hand on her waist, and looked at me with a detached, clinical coldness. He told me that she was the new face of the Sterling Group, a woman with the right pedigree to represent the brand on a global stage. He spoke about her as if she were a software upgrade, a more efficient model that didn't carry the baggage of his humble beginnings. In that moment, the realization hit me like a physical weight. He hadn't just replaced me in his bed. He had hired a ghost to inhabit the life I had created, and he expected me to vanish into the shadows without a sound. But as I looked at the box of my discarded memories, a spark of fire ignited in my soul, and I knew that if I was the one who built this empire, I was the only one who knew exactly which stone to pull to make the whole thing come crashing down. Module 4, the silence that followed his declaration, was heavier than any scream could have been. I watched them standing there, two people posing for a portrait of a life they hadn't earned, while the dust of my own history settled on the floor between us. Marcus didn't realize that by stripping me of my title, my home, and my dignity, he had also stripped me of my fear. When you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for an explanation. I simply walked over to the cardboard box, reached inside, and pulled out a small, tattered leather-bound ledger that the young woman had tossed aside like trash. Marcus's face turned a pale shade of gray the moment his eyes landed on it. He knew exactly what was inside those pages. Long before we had digital clouds and encrypted servers, I had kept a physical record of every hand we shook, every favor we traded, and every creative, accounting move we made in those early, desperate years to stay afloat. He thought he had deleted me from the system, but he forgot that I was the system. I looked at the young woman, who was now watching us with a flickering sense of unease, her polished facade starting to crack at the edges. I told her that she wasn't stepping into a dream. She was stepping into a crime scene, and the man she thought was a titan was actually a house of cards held together by my silence. Marcus stepped forward, his voice dropping into a low, threatening growl, warning me to put the book down and leave quietly if I wanted to keep my monthly allowance. I laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the marble walls. I told him that he couldn't buy the one thing he had never possessed, integrity. As I turned to leave, I saw the first real flash of terror in his eyes, the realization that his ghost was very much alive and held the match that could ignite his entire world. I walked out of that penthouse not as a discarded wife, but as a woman on a mission to reclaim the blood, sweat, and tears that had been weaponized against me. The war had officially begun, and I knew that by sunrise, the Sterling Group would realize that the foundation they were standing on was about to give way. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, but I didn't feel the chill. I only felt the steady, rhythmic thrum of the ledger against my side. Marcus thought he had purged me, but he had forgotten that an empire built on secrets is only as strong as the person who keeps them. I drove to a small, nondescript motel on the edge of the city, a place where the neon lights flickered and no one asked for a resume. Inside that cramped room, I spread the pages of my life across the faded bedspread. Every entry was a map of his greed. I saw the offshore accounts he thought were invisible, the shell companies we had created in moments of panic, and the names of powerful men who owed their fortunes to the favors Marcus had brokered behind closed doors. He had spent the last year trying to turn me into a ghost, but as I traced the ink of our shared history, I realized I was the only one who truly existed in this story. The woman he replaced me with was merely a costume, a polished exterior meant to distract the board of directors while he finished draining the company's soul. By midnight, I wasn't just a woman seeking revenge. I was a strategist preparing for a siege. I knew the Sterling Group was preparing for a massive public offering, a move that would make Marcus one of the wealthiest men in the country and cement his legacy forever. He needed my silence for just 48 more hours to finalize the deal. He thought I would go to the coastal house and fade away like a sunset, but he underestimated the fire of a woman who has been treated like a shadow in her own home. I picked up the phone and made a single call to a contact I hadn't spoken to in a decade, a man who dealt in the kind of truths that broke markets and ended dynasties. I didn't want his money, and I didn't want the house. I wanted the world to see the rot beneath the gold plating. As the dial tone hummed in my ear, I looked at my reflection in the cracked motel mirror and saw a Janet I hadn't seen in years, a woman who didn't need a billionaire's permission to exist. The countdown had begun, and Marcus was about to learn that the most expensive thing he ever owned was the loyalty he chose to throw away. The man on the other end of the line was Elias Thorne, a relentless investigative journalist who lived for the moment the powerful fell from grace. When he heard my voice, the silence on the line was thick with the realization that the untouchable Marcus Sterling had finally left a trail. I didn't feed him gossip, I gave him coordinates. I told him to meet me at a diner where the coffee was bitter and the booths offered shadows deep enough to hide a revolution. While the city slept, I sat in that booth, clutching the ledger like a shield, knowing that once I opened those pages to a stranger, there was no turning back. Marcus had spent months painting me as a bitter, aging woman who had lost her grip on reality, a narrative designed to discredit any word I might speak against him. But numbers do not have emotions, and bank transfers do not tell lies. When Elias arrived and began flipping through the handwritten entries, his eyes widened with the kind of hunger that only comes from uncovering a truth that could level a skyline. He saw the signatures, the dates, and the systematic funneling of investor funds into private accounts. A trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to the new life Marcus was building for himself and his ghost replacement. Elias looked at me and asked why I was doing this now, after 30 years of silence. I told him the truth. It wasn't about the money or the betrayal of the heart. It was about the fact that Marcus had tried to erase my very existence to maintain an image. He wanted the empire without the evidence of the woman who laid the bricks. As we spoke, my phone began to vibrate incessantly on the table. Marcus was calling, likely alerted by his security team that I hadn't gone to the coast. I watched his name flash on the screen, a name I once cherished, now a symbol of a life I was about to incinerate. I didn't answer. I simply pushed the ledger across the table to Elias and told him he had 24 hours to verify the data before the Sterling Group went public. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. For 3 decades, I had been the wind beneath Marcus's wings, but tonight, I decided to become the storm that brought him down. The man who thought he could replace a queen with a puppet was about to find out that the queen still held the keys to the treasury, and she was more than willing to burn the palace to the ground to ensure justice was served. The morning of the public offering arrived with a deceptive stillness that felt like the air before a lightning strike. I stood across the street from the stock exchange, masked and blending into the crowd of rushing commuters, watching the black SUVs pull up to the curb. Marcus stepped out, looking every bit the titan he had spent 30 years pretending to be, with his new partner draped on his arm like a trophy. She was smiling for the cameras, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my first year's salary, while he adjusted his cuffs with a smug confidence that made my skin crawl. He thought he had won. He thought the papers I had signed under duress had silenced me forever, and that the ledger was just a ghost story I had invented to scare him. But as he walked up those marble steps to ring the bell that would crown him a king, Elia's thorn was hitting publish on a story that would turn that crown into a noose. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Elia's simply saying, "The truth is out." I watched the jumbo screens overlooking the plaza, waiting for the shift. It started as a murmur among the crowd of traders, then a frantic checking of tablets and phones. The headline began to crawl across the digital tickers in bright, aggressive red. Sterling Group, the secret ledger of a stolen empire. I saw the moment the news hit Marcus's inner circle. His head of security whispered something in his ear, and the color drained from Marcus's face so fast it was as if he had seen his own ghost. He looked around the plaza, his eyes darting frantically, searching for me in the sea of faces he had spent a lifetime looking down upon. He knew I was there. He knew that the woman he had dismissed as a relic had just dismantled his life's work with a single stroke of a pen. The young woman beside him began to pull away, her practiced smile dissolving into a mask of panic as she realized the ship she had just boarded was sinking into an ocean of scandal. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on his from a distance, watching the precise moment his empire cracked down the middle. He had tried to replace my blood and sweat with a hollow image, but he forgot that a facade cannot support a building. Only the foundation can do that, and I had just walked away with the ground beneath his feet. The chaos on the steps of the exchange was a symphony of justice that played out in slow motion before my eyes. Security guards scrambled to shield Marcus from the sudden onslaught of flashing cameras and shouting reporters, but there is no shield strong enough to protect a man from his own past. I watched as his new partner, the woman he had chosen for her pedigree, physically recoiled from him as the first wave of federal agents pushed through the crowd. She didn't stay to defend him. She didn't offer a hand of support. She turned her back and disappeared into the glass lobby, proving that a ghost has no loyalty to a dying flame. Marcus stood alone, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. He looked broken, stripped of the aura of invincibility that I had spent 30 years carefully cultivating for him. I felt no joy in his downfall, only a profound, cold clarity. I walked toward the edge of the plaza, close enough to see the sweat glistening on his forehead and the way his hands trembled as he reached for a phone that was no longer ringing with offers, but with demands for an explanation. He finally caught sight of me standing near the fountain. For a brief second, the world around us vanished, leaving only the architect and the man who tried to steal the blueprint. I didn't need to say a word. The ledger was gone, the truth was public, and the assistant he had tried to exile had become the judge of his destiny. He reached out a hand, a desperate, silent plea for me to step forward and fix the unfixable, to use my strength to prop him up one last time. But I simply adjusted my coat and turned away, leaving him to face the cameras and the handcuffs on his own. I had spent my life building a man who was hollow at the core, and now, as the sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized that the only thing I truly needed to build was my own future. The Sterling Group was falling, the gold was melting away, and for the first time in 3 decades, I was breathing air that didn't belong to a billionaire's ambition. The sound of the sirens grew louder, a piercing wail that signaled the end of the Marcus Sterling era, but for me, it was the sound of a heavy door finally swinging open. I didn't stay to watch them lead him away. I didn't need the satisfaction of seeing the metal cuffs close around his wrists to know he was defeated. I walked back to my modest car, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months, and drove toward the one place Marcus never thought to look, the old warehouse where we had started everything. It was a dusty, forgotten building in a part of the city that the new Marcus would never deign to visit, but it was the only property still legally registered in my name alone. As I stepped inside the hollow, echoing space, the smell of grease and old paper filled my senses, reminding me of the woman I was before I became a billionaire's shadow. I realized then that while Marcus was busy chasing the ghost of a perfect life, I had been the one holding the actual keys to our beginning. He had tried to replace me with a woman who looked like success, but he failed to realize that success isn't a look, it's the grit in the bone and the memory of the struggle. I sat on a wooden crate in the center of that dark room, watching the dust motes dance in a single beam of light, and I began to plan my next move. The world thought Janet Sterling was a victim of a high-profile divorce, a discarded wife left with nothing but memories. They didn't know that the ledger I gave to Elias Thorne was only volume 1. Marcus had been so focused on hiding his current crimes that he forgot I was the one who managed the transition of our first million, a million that had been moved, legally and quietly, into a trust he could never touch. He had called me a relic, a piece of his past to be discarded, but a relic is often the most valuable thing in the room. As the news reports began to flood the airwaves with stories of his fraud and the collapse of the Sterling Group, I sat in the silence of my own empire, knowing that I wasn't just surviving the wreckage. I was the one who had cleared the site for something new, something that would never be built on the back of another person's sacrifice. The ghost had been exorcised, the billionaire was in ruins, and Aunt Janet was just getting started. The walls of the old warehouse seemed to breathe with me, a stark contrast to the suffocating luxury of the life I had just dismantled. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the concrete floor, my phone lit up with a final, desperate message from Marcus. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a lifeline, claiming that we could still fix this if I just retracted my statement to Elias. Even at the bottom of the pit he had dug for himself, he still tried to use the word "we" as a weapon to pull me back into the abyss. I deleted the message without a second thought. The man who had tried to replace me with a younger, polished version of myself was now finding out that a ghost cannot testify in court and a trophy cannot pay for a legal defense. Reports were already surfacing that his new partner had fled the state the moment the first subpoena was served, taking with her whatever jewelry and cash she could grab from the penthouse. She was exactly what he deserved, a reflection of his own shallow greed. I stood up and walked to the back of the warehouse, where a heavy iron safe sat hidden under a tarp. I turned the dial, the clicks sounding like the ticking of a clock counting down to his total erasure. Inside wasn't just money. It was evidence of the patents and intellectual property that Marcus had borrowed from my early designs he had dismissed as feminine hobbies while he marketed them as his own genius. He didn't just steal my time, he tried to steal my mind, but I had kept the original sketches, the dated prototypes, and the proof of my authorship. While the feds were dismantling his financial shell games, I was preparing to reclaim the very soul of the company. I wasn't going to let the Sterling Group just die. I was going to strip it of his name and rebuild it under mine. The gilded betrayal he had orchestrated was a masterclass in arrogance, but he had forgotten the most basic rule of architecture. You never betray the person who knows where the bodies are buried and how the concrete was poured. As I looked out the window at the city skyline, I saw the lights of the Sterling Tower flicker and dim, a symbolic end to a 30-year lie. The world was about to meet the real power behind the throne, and this time I wouldn't be standing in the shadows. I would be the light that revealed everything he tried to hide. The headlines the next morning were a brutal autopsy of a fallen king, but I spent the hours in a cold, calculated silence, watching the vultures circle the carcass of Marcus's reputation. I sat in a small office I had rented under a maiden name, the walls bare and the air smelling of stale coffee, a far cry from the silk-lined walls of the mansion I once called home. My legal team, a group of hungry, young attorneys who saw Marcus as the ultimate trophy, laid out the strategy that would finalize his ruin. We weren't just going after the assets he had hidden. We were filing a massive intellectual property suit that would prove the core technology of his empire was never his to begin with. Every time he had looked me in the eye and called me a partner while signing my work away, he was handing me the rope he was now hanging by. The tension in the room was electric as we reviewed the leaked footage of his arrest. He looked old, frantic, and pathetically small without the armor of my protection. I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a profound realization of how much energy I had wasted keeping a hollow man upright. Marcus tried to call me again from the holding cell, his voice on the recorded line cracking as he begged me to remember the good times and the legacy we built together. I listened to his voice for exactly 10 seconds before I realized he still didn't get it. He wasn't mourning the loss of our love or our history. He was mourning the loss of his audience. He missed the woman who would clap for him while he performed a life that belonged to her. I told the lawyer to block the calls and proceed with the filing. By noon, the news cycle shifted from his financial fraud to the shocking revelation that the genius behind the Sterling Group had actually been a thief of his wife's intellect for 3 decades. The public's fascination turned to fury, and the board of directors, the same men who had ignored me in meetings for years, began calling my private line, desperate for a savior to stop the stock from hitting zero. I let the phone ring. I wanted them to feel the weight of the silence I had lived in. I wanted them to understand that when you try to replace the foundation with a ghost, the only thing left to do is watch the roof cave in. I wasn't just taking back my company. I was taking back the 30 years he had tried to erase, and I was doing it with a cold, surgical precision that he never knew I possessed. The board members finally cornered me in a private lounge at the edge of the financial district, their faces pale and their arrogance replaced by a desperate, sweating humility. These were the same men who had looked through me during holiday parties and stepped over my shadow to toast Marcus's brilliance. But now, they were offering me his chair as if it were a gift rather than my stolen property. I sat across from them, my hands folded neatly on the table, refusing the expensive bottled water and the hollow apologies they tried to offer. They spoke in hushed, panicked tones about brand stabilization and market confidence, terrified that the Sterling name had become a permanent stain on their portfolios. I let them ramble until the room grew uncomfortably quiet, the only sound being the distant hum of the city that was currently laughing at their downfall. When I finally spoke, my voice was a low, steady blade that cut through their corporate jargon. I told them that the Sterling Group was a corpse, and I had no interest in performing a resurrection for a name that was built on a foundation of theft and betrayal. I presented them with a choice that felt more like an execution. They could either face a decade of litigation, as I proved every patent they owned was fraudulent, or they could facilitate a total liquidation of Marcus's remaining shares and transfer the core intellectual property back to my new firm. One of the elder directors tried to argue, mentioning the emotional complexity of the divorce, but I shut him down with a single look that reminded him I wasn't his colleague's wife anymore. I was his largest creditor. Marcus had tried to replace me with a ghost, but ghosts don't have the power to sign contracts or command a boardroom. By the time I walked out of that meeting, I had secured the rights to everything I had ever created, leaving Marcus with nothing but the legal bills for a life he could no longer afford. I drove past our old penthouse one last time, seeing the for sale signs already being hammered into the ground, and I felt a sense of liberation that was sharper and more intoxicating than any wealth. He was sitting in a cell, surrounded by the silence he once tried to impose on me, while I was finally stepping into a world where my name would be the only one that mattered. The empire was gone, the man was broken, and the architect was finally home. The final meeting at the prison was a formality I didn't owe him, but I wanted Marcus to look into the eyes of the woman he thought he could erase one last time before the steel doors became his only horizon. He sat behind the thick glass, his skin sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights and his designer shirt wrinkled and stained, looking like a man who had finally realized that his reflection was empty. He tried to muster that old, manipulative charm, pressing his hand against the glass and whispering about the empire we could still save if I just used my influence to soften the prosecution's heart. He actually believed that after replacing me with a younger face and stripping me of my dignity, I would still be his shield. I looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound sense of detachment, as if I were observing a specimen in a jar. I told him that the empire he spoke of was already gone. I had personally overseen the dismantling of every board seat and the rebranding of every patent he had stolen. I informed him that the ghost he had brought into our home had turned over his private journals to the authorities in exchange for immunity, proving that his betrayal of me was just one small part of his betrayal of the law. The look of pure, unadulterated terror that crossed his face was the only payment I required for 30 years of service. He started to scream, his voice muffled by the glass, accusing me of being cold and heartless, as if my refusal to be his victim was a crime in itself. I didn't flinch. I told him that I wasn't the one who had turned our life into a battlefield. I was simply the one who won the war he started. As I stood up to leave, he begged to know what would happen to his name, his legacy, and the gold-plated world he had built. I leaned in close to the glass and told him that from this day forward, the name Sterling would be synonymous with failure and fraud, while the woman he tried to bury was about to build a future that wouldn't have a single inch of room for him. I walked out of that visiting room and didn't look back, feeling the weight of his shadow finally fall away from my heels. The betrayal was complete, but it wasn't mine. It was the world finally turning its back on a man who thought loyalty was something you could trade for a newer model. The walk from the prison gates to my car was the longest journey of my life, every step feeling like a shackle falling away into the gravel. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged crown of glass and steel that no longer looked intimidating, but merely like a collection of fragile things waiting to be reclaimed. Marcus was now a prisoner of the four walls he had built with his own lies, while I was returning to a world that was suddenly wide open and silent. I drove back to the small warehouse, the place where our blood and sweat had first stained the floor, and I realized that this was the only ground that hadn't been poisoned by his vanity. I spent the night under the harsh glow of a single industrial bulb, spread out across the floor with the original blueprints of my designs, the ones he told me were too unrefined for the market. I saw the genius in my own lines that I had allowed him to suppress for the sake of his ego. It was a dark realization. I hadn't just been his partner, I had been his host, providing the life force for a parasite that eventually thought it was the king. My phone began to glow with notifications of the morning news. The liquidation of the Sterling Group had begun. The penthouse was being seized, the private jets were being grounded, and the ghost woman had vanished into the wind, leaving behind nothing but the scent of that expensive perfume and a trail of unpaid bills. Marcus had traded a diamond for a reflection in a mirror, and now the mirror was shattered. I felt a cold, sharp focus take hold of me. I wasn't going to just start a company, I was going to start a movement. I reached out to the workers, the engineers, the assistants, and the laborers whom Marcus had treated like disposable tools, and I told them that the real architect was back. I offered them a stake in a new venture, one built on the truth he feared. The betrayal had been deep, cutting through 30 years of my life, but the scar it left was harder than the skin that was there before. I looked at the dark corners of the warehouse and didn't see shadows anymore. I saw the space where my new empire would rise, and this time there would be no gold plating to hide the rot because there would be no rot to hide. The man who thought he could replace me had only succeeded in setting me free, and as the first light of dawn touched the dusty windows, I knew that the world was about to see what happens when a woman stops building for a man and starts building for herself. The transition from a billionaire's wife to a revolutionary leader was a transformation fueled by the cold, hard fuel of a woman who had seen the bottom of a lie and decided to climb out using the debris. I stood in the center of that hollow warehouse, no longer wearing the silk and pearls of a puppet, but the rugged clothes of a builder, surrounded by a dozen former employees who had been discarded by Marcus like broken machinery. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope, recognizing in my eyes the same fire that had once built the Sterling Group before it was suffocated by greed. I told them that we weren't here to rebuild a dead man's dream. We were here to harvest the seeds of the technology he had stolen and plant them in honest soil. The tension in the room was thick as I revealed the secondary set of blueprints, the ones Marcus never knew existed because he never cared enough to look into my private office. These were designs for a sustainable energy grid that could change the industry, a project he had laughed at as domestic and unprofitable. As we worked through the night, the news on the small television in the corner continued to dissect the carcass of our former life. They showed footage of the penthouse being emptied, the movers carrying out the expensive art and the furniture I had chosen with such care, but I felt no attachment to those things. They were the trimmings of a cage, and I was finally outside of it. My phone rang. It was Marcus's lead attorney, his voice trembling as he informed me that Marcus was facing a 20-year sentence and was begging for a character reference. I didn't even give him the courtesy of a verbal refusal. I simply hung up and watched the screen of my phone go dark, reflecting my own face back at me. I was 60 years old, starting over in a dusty garage with a group of outcasts, yet for the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel tired. I felt inevitable. Marcus had tried to replace me with a ghost because he thought a ghost would be easier to control, but he forgot that ghosts are just the spirits of people who have unfinished business. My business was far from finished. By the time the sun rose, we had the first prototype of the new grid humming in the center of the floor, a low, rhythmic pulse that sounded like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been cold for too long. The gilded betrayal was the end of his story, but it was only the prologue to mine, and I was ready to show the world that the assistant was actually the mastermind all along. The silence of the industry was shattered when my new firm, Phoenix Systems, announced its first major contract, bypassing the corporate gatekeepers who had once bowed to Marcus. I watched from the shadows of our operations center as the media tried to piece together how a discarded socialite had secured the very patents that were supposed to have died with the Sterling Group. They didn't understand that while Marcus was busy preening for the cameras and chasing the ghost of a younger life, I was the one who had filed the original paperwork in my name before he ever had a chance to forge my signature. The tension in the business world was palpable. It was as if a ghost had reached out from a grave to reclaim its crown. I received word that Marcus had been moved to a permanent facility, a place of gray concrete and iron bars that offered no view of the skyline he once thought he owned. He sent a letter through his sister, a woman who had never liked me but was now desperate for a handout. The letter was a rambling mess of self-pity, blaming me for tricking him into a false sense of security while I planned my coup. He still couldn't see the reality of his own actions. He saw my survival as a betrayal of his right to destroy me. I burned the letter in a metal trash can without finishing it, the smoke rising in a thin, bitter line toward the ceiling. I wasn't interested in his narrative or his excuses. Every day, more of his former associates, the men who had once ignored my presence, sent flowers, invitations, and apologies, trying to bridge the gap between their past disrespect and my current power. I ignored them all. I didn't want their validation any more than I wanted Marcus's remorse. I was focused on the heavy work of restructuring the entire energy sector, proving that the woman who built his empire with her blood was more than capable of building her own with her brain. The ghost he had replaced me with was eventually found working at a low-end retail shop in another state, her designer life having evaporated the moment the credit cards were frozen. She was a casualty of his vanity, just as I was meant to be, but I refused to play the part. As I stood before my growing team of engineers, I told them that the era of the figurehead was over. We weren't building for fame or for a man's ego. We were building for a world that Marcus had forgotten existed while he was busy looking in the mirror. The official launch of Phoenix Systems was not held in a ballroom, but in the very warehouse where the walls still held the echoes of my struggle. The air was thick with a different kind of tension, now not the suffocating weight of Marcus's lies, but the electric charge of a truth finally set free. The industry's elite arrived in their black cars, stepping onto the cracked pavement with an air of uncomfortable curiosity, forced to acknowledge the woman they had spent decades treating as a background character. I stood on a modest stage, the lighting stark and unforgiving, wearing a simple black suit that felt more like armor than fashion. There was no ghost beside me, no trophy to distract from the work, and no man to take credit for my words. When I spoke, my voice didn't shake. It carried the weight of 30 years of silenced expertise. I didn't mention Marcus by name, but everyone in that room felt his absence like a cold draft. I spoke about the gilded betrayal, not as a personal tragedy, but as a systemic failure of a world that values the mask over the face and the thief over the creator. I revealed the full scale of the energy grid we had built, a system so efficient and so transparent that it made Marcus's old business model look like a primitive scam. The crowd was silent, the kind of silence that happens when people realize they are witnessing the birth of a new era. In the back of the room, I saw a few of the old board members whispering, their faces etched with the realization that they hadn't just lost a company. They had lost the right to be on the winning side of history. As the presentation ended and the first wave of investors rushed forward, desperate to attach themselves to my success, I felt a strange, cold peace. I wasn't the wife of a billionaire anymore. I wasn't the victim of a replacement. I was the architect of a future that no longer required his permission to exist. I looked at the old, stained rafters of the warehouse and realized that the blood I had poured into the foundation all those years ago hadn't been a sacrifice to Marcus. It had been a down payment on my own freedom. The man who replaced me with a ghost was now a ghost himself, haunted by the memory of the woman he thought he could break, while I was standing in the light, finally visible, finally heard, and finally whole. The victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a reckoning that had been 30 years in the making. As Phoenix Systems began to dominate the headlines, the legal walls finally closed in on the last of Marcus's hidden assets. I sat in my office late one evening, the city lights shimmering like cold diamonds outside my window, as my lead investigator handed me a final file. It contained the details of the ghost's final departure. She had tried to sell the vintage pearls Marcus had given her, only to discover they were high-quality fakes. He had even lied to the woman he replaced me with, proving that a man who builds his life on a foundation of sand will eventually deceive everyone he touches. I felt a hollow shiver of realization. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me, he had betrayed the very concept of value. He had spent his life chasing the appearance of wealth while I was the one creating the actual substance. My phone buzzed with a notification that the Sterling Tower was being officially renamed. The gold-plated letters that once screamed his name were being chiseled away, leaving behind raw stone and empty spaces. It was a physical manifestation of his legacy, a void that no amount of money could fill. I received a final, frantic message from his sister, claiming that Marcus had suffered a breakdown in his cell and was asking to see me one last time to set the record straight. I knew what that meant. He wanted one last chance to spin the narrative, to try and find a way to make himself the hero of a story he had set on fire. I didn't respond. The record was already set in the black and white of the ledger, in the blueprints of my technology, and in the eyes of the people he had stepped on to reach a peak that turned out to be a mirage. The tension that had lived in my chest for 3 decades was finally dissipating, replaced by a heavy, purposeful calm. I looked at the prototype on my desk, a device that represented more truth than any of the luxury cars or yachts Marcus had used to define us. I wasn't just a woman who had survived a billionaire. I was the woman who had outlived his myth. The betrayal was no longer a wound. It was the forge that had hardened me into something unbreakable. As the night deepened, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing him in a cell. It was the fact that I no longer needed to see him at all to know exactly who I was. Module 19, the final chapter of the Sterling legacy, was written not in a courtroom, but in the silence of the city's records office, where I officially signed the documents to dissolve the last of our shared holdings. As I put the pen to the paper, I felt the final thread of a 30-year rope snap, releasing me from the weight of a man who had tried to drown me in his own vanity. Marcus's empire was now a matter of history, a cautionary tale taught in business schools about the dangers of arrogance and the fragility of a stolen foundation. News reached me that the penthouse, the place where he had stood with that woman and told me I was a relic, had been sold at auction to a charitable foundation. It was being turned into a shelter for women who had been displaced by domestic and financial abuse. There was a poetic justice in that transition. The rooms that once echoed with his cold dismissal would now provide sanctuary for the very spirits he tried to crush. I stood on the balcony of my new office, which overlooked the harbor rather than the skyscrapers, and watched the fog roll in over the water. The tension that had defined my life, the constant need to protect him, to hide his flaws, and to bolster his ego, had been replaced by a quiet, rhythmic focus on the work ahead. I was no longer Aunt Janet, the billionaire's wife. I was Janet, the architect of a new energy. I received a final report from the prison. Marcus had stopped asking for me. He had retreated into a world of his own making, a world where he was still a king, surrounded by imaginary subordinates and invisible wealth. He was truly living with ghosts now, the only companions left for a man who chose a facade over a soul. I looked at the calloused skin on my palms, the marks of a woman who had worked for everything she owned, and I realized that these were my truest jewels. The betrayal had been a fire, yes, but it didn't consume me. It merely burned away the dross, leaving behind the tempered steel of a woman who knew her own worth. As the city lights began to flicker on, I felt a surge of anticipation for the morning. For the first time in my life, the sun wouldn't be rising on Marcus's world, but on a horizon that I had cleared with my own hands. The gilded betrayal was over, and the woman who was replaced by a ghost had finally stepped into the solid, unyielding light of her own reality. The final echoes of Marcus Sterling's name have faded into the cold corridors of the justice system, leaving behind a silence that is finally mine to fill. I stood one last time by the shoreline, looking out at the dark, churning water that had once felt like a barrier to my freedom. For 30 years, I believed that my value was tied to the empire I was building for another man, but the gilded betrayal taught me that the only empire worth having is the one you build within yourself. Marcus thought he could replace me with a ghost, a polished image of youth and obedience, but he forgot that an image has no substance and a ghost cannot hold a flame. Today, Phoenix Systems stands as a testament to what happens when the foundation finally stands up and speaks its own name. I have reclaimed my inventions, my dignity, and my future from the hands of a thief who called himself a king. As I watch the sun rise over a city that no longer belongs to him, I feel a profound sense of peace. The betrayal was bitter, and the journey through the darkness was long, but I emerged not as a victim, but as a victor who no longer needs a billionaire's shadow to feel protected. I am Janet, a woman of 60 years who has traded the cage of high society for the raw power of the truth. My story is a reminder to every soul who feels invisible. Your sacrifice is seen, your work has value, and no one can truly replace you when you are the one who holds the blueprint to your own life. The gold has melted away, the lies have been exposed, and the only thing left standing is the woman who refused to stay buried. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. Thank you for listening to my journey and for standing with me until the very end. Your support means more than I can say. Thank you.